Hey there, Reconciled Church. Pastor Kevin here, back with another installment in our series from the cutting room floor, where basically I take the material that would have just made the sermon run a little bit too long and break it down for you as like a little extra Bible study in the week. So, what I wanted to look at today is kind of like a weird thing. There's this phrase or this little participle, whatever you call it. Was not an English teacher, so if I'm butchering that, sorry. That keeps coming up in John's gospel. So he keeps explaining what words mean. He says, which means. So let me give you the examples from our passage we looked at this week. John chapter 1, first, verse 38. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher. "Where are you staying?" Verse 41. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. And then the third occurrence is in verse 42. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. Okay, so why is it that John keeps explaining to us what words mean? There has to be like a reason behind it, and basically what I think there's something significant here for us to understand. Actually, what he's doing here is he's explaining to an audience that wouldn't be as familiar with certain words that have a like Hebrew origin. So if you weren't a Jew, basically, you may not be as familiar with some of these terms. So the Greek-speaking Gentiles wouldn't use the word rabbi. They'd just say didaskale, or teacher is how we translate that. We get our words for like didactic from that. Nor would they use the word Messiah. They'd use the word Christos, or Christ. But why does this matter? So this seems like such a non-point. Why do I think this is significant? Well, it clues us into who John's original audience was. Basically, John was writing to some people who were familiar with Judaism, and he was also writing to some people who were unfamiliar with it, and would be more familiar with contemporary Greco-Roman thought. For example, his reference we see in the prologue of John's gospel, what we find is John is referencing creation, but he's not necessarily telling us like where from. He's not like as it is written per se here. Instead, he just kind of is subtly hinting at this idea of the creation narrative from Genesis. But also he's taking terms that the Greeks would be more familiar with, like the idea of the logos, or the word, and as we've been talking about, applies that in a Christian way. Basically, he takes a term they already had, this idea of the logos, or the word, and he kind of flips it on his head. He fills it with Christian meaning, or biblical meaning, if you will. So he doesn't assume that everyone he was writing to was familiar with the Old Testament. This is important. This tells us who he was writing to. John was writing to people who would not be familiar with Judaism, so Greek-speaking people, Gentiles. But also there's like this way in which the book rewards you if you know your Old Testament a little bit better. So if you're familiar with some of these references, you get a little more out of it than other things. It's kind of like a movie that rewards itself on repeat viewing. If there's ever been like a movie that you watched again and again, and you always kept finding that you were like learning new things, like figuring out new things from the movie that you didn't notice before. John's gospel account's kind of like that. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I actually believe the way he describes this stuff here is a helpful tool for us in evangelism. So we talked about sharing our faith and the idea of come and see, and how we're presenting not only Christ, but like our lifestyle under like what the Christian life is to people. We're inviting them in. You want to know what how my faith intersects with my actions, how I actually live my life? Well, come and see. And I think when we're talking about this idea of sharing the gospel with others, I think this idea in John's gospel is helpful as well. So let me explain. A lot of methods of talking to non-believers about your faith involve talking in such a way to always highlight the differences in what you believe and what you disagree on. Now, I'm not saying that we don't do that. However, it's kind of interesting that John, and as I'll show, even Paul, has sort of a meet them where they are and help them kind of attitude, and then help them reframe their understanding of the world and their understanding of life from a biblical perspective. Lots of, like I said, this flies into against kind of the grain a little bit, because we generally go, well, you believe this and I believe this, and we don't agree on anything. But it's interesting that John's approach actually takes a concept that they would agree on sort of, but not exactly, and then he kind of fills it with meaning. So, hey, you guys have heard of this idea called the Logos. You guys have heard of this idea called the Word that is supposed to explain everything and give meaning to everything in life. Well, what I'm telling you is that thing isn't just a thing. It's God. It's a personal God. It's specifically, it's God who revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ. That's how John's approach goes. And so what we find him here doing is looking for areas in which our beliefs and the unbelievers' beliefs would kind of overlap, or as theologians often call it, we're looking for areas of common grace. And I actually think using this will help us give us some more confidence in sharing our faith with others. So as we speak to them, there are a number of things we might agree with them on, as well as many areas we might disagree with them on too. So it might be helpful to understand, as you're talking to someone who's a non-Christian, to understand there's concept ideas where we might have some agreement with. For example, let's say my neighbor is an agnostic. He says, I don't know if there's a God or not, but I don't necessarily see the evidence for it, things like that. But let's say my neighbor also is pro-life, and so he doesn't believe in abortion. He believes it's evil and it should be made illegal. Now, this is something me and my neighbor would agree with to some extent. Like, I would agree with him on this, but I think we reach that conclusion from two very different ways. So one of the things that's helpful then might be to say to my neighbor, hey, look, you think this stuff is evil. I think this stuff is evil. The reason I think this stuff is evil is because I think we have inherent value and worth because we were created by God, but also because we are told in the Bible we bear God's image or likeness. And so the image of God implies a certain amount of worth, value to every life, and therefore I think we should respect every life. Now, you see what I did? What happened there is I took something we shared, a shared belief, even though we might reach it from very different ways, and then kind of peeled the layers back and said, hey, look, this is why I believe the things I believe. I believe being able to show consistency in what we do as Christians is a big thing. We might agree with non-Christians in certain areas of life, but primarily the reason we agree with them is because all truth is God's truth. Whether they admit it or not, we're living in God's world, but the difference is, what I would argue, is that we're being consistent with our beliefs. I think the Apostle Paul uses a similar approach in Acts chapter 17, so let me share that with you. Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens. It says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. He has made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we move and live and have our being. Or, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Okay, so Paul takes a concept the men of Athens would have been familiar with. They had this idea that there was a God that they didn't know. And so they even would worship this God that they're like, we don't really know what this God's like, but we're still going to worship him just to make sure we've covered all our bases. And so what he says, hey, you know what? I agree with you to some extent. I agree there's a God that you do not know. But let me tell you about that God you do not know. He's not like these other gods. He's not like these other gods that you made or that need your service. That need your offerings, that need these things. Rather, this is the God who created the heavens and the earth. This is the God who created everything. And so instead, we rely on him. And not only that, we rely on him, we get life from him, and he wants us to seek him out and actually find him and know him. And so from there, he explains to them the person of Jesus. He even quotes one of their own philosophers that says, for indeed we are his offspring. And so what he's going to say is, yeah, to some extent we are God's offspring, and that we are made in his likeness. We are made by him. We derive our being from him. So what did Paul do there? He found something that they might actually agree with, but then he turned that idea on his head because he started filling that idea with biblical meaning. So this idea of the unknown God that they worshipped wasn't necessarily the triune God of the Bible. Instead, it was just this way of saying, well, there might be a deity out there that we're just not aware of. So he takes that idea and he turns it on its head and he fills it with biblical meaning. So one of the things I just kind of, as we wrap this up, is just to encourage you guys, finding commonality is a biblical way to share the gospel with people. So there is something to also not only knowing the ways we are different from the unbelieving world, but ways in which some of our values, some of our beliefs might actually intersect with theirs. So consider starting at points of agreement rather than necessarily points of disagreement. Now, there might be times where you start at a way, especially if you're talking to someone who's very antagonistic towards the faith, you might start with ways in which you differ. But also, here's the thing. The Bible does give examples of people starting with points of agreement as well, and saying, hey, look, you know what? Find an area where you and your unbelieving neighbor, friend, whatever, coworker might agree on, and then show them how that relates back to the story of the Bible, how that relates back to your faith in the gospel. And I believe as we do this, what you might be surprised to find, guys, is that the conversation actually goes further than you might have expected it. So with that said, guys, that's all I got for you for this week. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week with another lesson. Take care.